I want to join everybody else that has already spoken here in thanking the organizers of this event for putting this on, including the weather, which I just saw this morning because I didn't get in until very late last night from the East Coast. And when I walked out of my room this morning, I said, look where this is. Spectacular. I will move right into my presentation because I have a lot of things that I would like to set out for your consideration. And some of it may actually be a little bit provocative, but why not? I'm always provocative. Maybe I need to I need to do that, yeah. But before I do move into that, I would like to say that I enjoyed, particularly as I was preparing for this conference, on your website, the presentation that was live streamed there of last year, where you informed all the graduate students of SLAT as to what the programmatic opportunities were of this circle environment. And I thought, wow, look at what all they're getting. So I was very impressed. If you haven't done it, take the 38 minutes that it took to look all of this, and it gives you a very, very good sense of what this particular center does in outstanding ways. So you get something like a pre-reading activity or a pre-listening activity, precisely because I think there is a little bit of a shift in consideration that I would like to suggest. Namely, I will try to make this linked argument. I will say, first, when carefully considered by teaching professionals, the relatively rigorous practices that assessment demands can be a particularly good way to support the educational goals of language teaching and learning. This is in line with the focus here on assessment. Also, I would suggest that we may need to reconsider what we call intercultural competence. A reconsideration that on the one hand might make the term less expansive than it has been, less inclusive of just about everything, and would make it more theoretically grounded, perhaps more principled, more rigorous, more transparent, perhaps also, this would be my hope, more useful for informing instructional practice. And though nothing in intercultural competence is easy, perhaps ultimately, once we have worked our way through it, it might actually be more doable. Characterizing the proposal in general ways, I would then say this. At present, we are working with a notion of intercultural competence as primarily a sociological, anthropological, or psychological phenomenon. And we focus on attitudes, beliefs, values, dispositions, with a certain factual knowledge, of course, being presumed. I suggest that in the future, it is worth considering going to a much more explicitly language-based understanding of intercultural competence. That is, finding a way that would allow us, through the specifics of learner language use, foreign language learner or second language learner use, to find a way of getting a hold of, ultimately assessing, developing intercultural competence, not just intercultural competence alone, but a way of finding a trajectory for development. I consider all of those ingredients to be important. I would imagine that for most of you, this is a rather nebulous statement, and probably one to which deep down you're thinking, what else do you think we've been doing? And I would agree on some level. So that puts the burden on me even further to specify just exactly what I do mean by making that kind of a claim. After all, we've always put a value on these things. So let me attempt to specify just a little bit further. And those of you who know my work and my writing will be entirely familiar with this particular mantra, namely that I think it is imperative for us in our work, as contrasted with other people's work, to look at the development of L2 language abilities to advanced ability levels simultaneously with the development of intercultural competence. And I will, and Carol Chappell will like that, say assessment will help us do that a little, I hope she will, that assessment will help us be a little bit better at this. You can see my implicit claim here, and pretty soon it won't be very implicit, but quite explicit, is that we have focused on intercultural competence increasingly without really looking at the specifics of language. We have looked at it in other ways. This is the quote that called you all to respond to the call for papers. I won't reread it because I can assume that all of you are thoroughly in agreement with it. It's a quote by Michael Byram, who, of course, is typically taken as one of the key theorists of intercultural competence. Not to take away from the enormous contributions that Michael has made, I would actually, as I generally am in applied linguistics too, be a little bit more reticent to call some of these things theories. I would probably be more inclined to call many of these things reasonably good descriptors. I think we tend too quickly to call things theories. Side comment. So here is what he says in this particular article from which the quote was taken, which was, in fact, an assessment article, which drew me to it. He says, if it isn't tested, it's not taught. And I can see your hackles going up or other reactions coming to this particular quote, because the first one, of course, is something that we're all too familiar with on the basis of No Child Left Behind, all the negative consequences that can come with this kind of a statement. But I think there are other ways of looking at it. So people teach only what's tested. Yes and no. That can be seen negatively and positively. You could also say, if it isn't tested, how do we know that it was taught right? By that I mean, what is the evidence that these teaching efforts on our part actually led to something that was accessible? We could also say, of course, if it isn't tested, how do we know that it was learned? We may all think that it was learned, but I think most of us who have been in this profession have been disabused of that notion for quite some time, that just because we taught it, that it was learned. So how do we know? Once more, assessment is the way to get at it. And then I would like to suggest even a further thought. If it isn't tested, how do we really know what the it is that was to be taught and learned? What's the it? We have help, of course, from the literature, and 5 elements have typically been foregrounded, and these, I am sure, are quite familiar to you. I will be relatively brief. These are, again, the ones that Michael Byram foregrounds, speaking about attitudes, curiosity, openness, readiness to suspend disbelief are typically listed. Knowledge of social groups and their products and practices, theirs, my own, skills of interpreting and relating different aspects of the culture, particularly the ability to interpret documents or events of that culture, skills of discovery and interaction, the ability in particular to acquire new knowledge of that culture and its cultural practices, and of course then the ability to operate with that knowledge. And finally, critical cultural awareness, and that would include political education, an ability to evaluate critically on the basis of explicit criteria, perspectives, practices, and products. For those of you familiar with the standards, and I'm sure everybody in this room is, there are many echoes there, although upon closer inspection, of course, one can also find differences. I feel almost awkward talking about this with Celeste Kinginger sitting in the audience. But here I am presenting it like this. How does Michael Byram go about doing that when it comes to assessment? And I think this is important. He takes approaches to assessment of intercultural competence from within the project of the Common European Framework of Reference. That is very often something that's forgotten when we look at this material, because the European context and the CEFR context are highly specific contexts that should not be generalized to the American environment. Clearly, they have something to say, but I believe what they have to say is in need of some translation. What he does with a focus on portfolio assessment, again, something that we generally find quite appropriate, is that there's a passport section, that there is a language biography, and finally, there's a dossier. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on that because these things are relatively familiar to you. He provides examples for these things within a self-assessment environment. One more time, these are things that are very, very familiar to you. I don't think I need to spend time, and he gives nice examples for each one of them. I would venture to say most of us would say, yes, of course. We are the choir, and the choir is very happy to sing along with these kinds of songs. The question I would like to pose is, how is this related to language learning, and I guess I could have added to the developing ability to know a language and to work with in an intercultural context? What do we have? We have the use of self-assessment. That's fine. It gets at central roles of values, beliefs, and attitudes. It, with its particular focus on a lifelong trajectory, assumes, number one, an in-country sojourn, perhaps over longer periods of time. And as you know, the European Union, of course, has extraordinary programs in that regard. The numbers of exchanges of students is absolutely staggering when you look at the kinds of experiences that are made available to students. And as I said, it has a very strong appreciation of the fact that this isn't going to happen overnight, that this takes a long, long time. Portfolio assessment in itself has a great attraction to the American scene because we are under assessment regimes. And here's one quote that I took from Jackie Bott van Houten, who has been very much engaged in the CFR and portfolio assessment. And she makes an interesting comment about what's the difference between the standards project and the CFR project, where she sees it in the second section here, where the American foreign language standards urge us to understand culture as products, practices, and perspectives. The European concept of interculturality suggests learners look at how they use language to negotiate meaning and understanding in a context that demonstrates awareness and appreciation of our own and the other's culture. Again, I don't think there's much to be argued about, but the question is, where do our students have this context? This particular context, conference, of course, is focused on immersion settings. There, we most definitely will have to look at these kinds of things. But if I am reading the literature right, a good bit of the ability of our students to perform like this in the study abroad context will need some very, very serious underpinnings in the instructional environment before we ever send them abroad. And I think it is that particular aspect that needs to have a much more thorough look, and this is where my argument is located, linking language acquisition and intercultural development. So, marching down further, we have a centrality of attitudes, knowledge, beliefs, but it is not linked in any systematic way to language abilities and language use. We have no discernible relationship between language development and the development of intercultural abilities, except, presumably, just like with language learning, more is better. Why don't you do it better? We have no principled tie-in of self-assessment, because the focus is so much on self-assessment, with curriculum and instruction, such that the assessment might inform the improvement of curriculum and instruction, what we all know as the washback factor. In sum, what this means is we can be prone to ad hoc listing of endless, and I mean endless, scenarios of facts, and if one wanted to be critical, factoids. And what is your fact is my factoid, and what is my factoid is your fact. In other words, what counts as something that we think they ought to know? We have limited usability or usefulness for instructed language learning, which happens to be the interest I have and I think is something that has to be considered before we send people abroad. And we have no tie-in with literacy phenomena. This is primarily oral interaction. Conversation is privileged almost exclusively, essentially working off the framework that we have worked with over the last 30 years, namely of communicative competence. And to me, there's every evidence that it is likely to be insufficient for educational settings, particularly at the college level for adult learners. We have that as our task, but we have much more as our task. And unless we look at that right from the beginning, we actually create a situation for the students that makes life so much harder for them than it needs to be. So we have a dilemma. And now I'm going to shift pretty quickly here. What are the reasons for this dilemma? There are, of course, 101. I should have said reasons with many S's behind it. I think one of the reasons is that language teaching and learning generally does not work in our conceptualization of what goes on with a functionally oriented theory of language. What do I mean by that? In other words, it generally does not think of language as a meaning potential, the system of language as a meaning potential, that it is a resource for meaning and for creating meaning, and at the end, it is the user that makes choices. A functional theory puts this underneath its entire conceptualization. It is interested in how people use the language, and it says that from the standpoint of language as a semiotic system that has developed over eons for human beings, that semiotic system in itself and how it is reflects that use. So, consequently, if one were to look carefully on how language does what it does, one would be able to discern exactly all of those aspects that we otherwise put under communication, intercultural communication, pragmatics, whatever. So what is the big need? We need a conceptualization and practice of language teaching and learning that is interested in the development of intercultural competence. And we may have to look at it from both sides, from the side of a quote-unquote new theory of language and quote-unquote new theory of culture, where both can be linked in a principled fashion such that attention to development is prioritized. From what I see, in general, there is no good theoretical underpinning for development in any of this discussion. Again, no news to those who know me. I will put forward systemic functional linguistics as an education-friendly functional theory of language that posits initially three very, very important functions of what language does. And unfortunately, I won't be able to go into the details, but you can imagine a meta function that is called ideational, accesses all the things that one needs to know. A meta function that is focused on the interpersonal accesses all of those things that relate to communication in general. And a meta function that relates to the textual is, and just exactly how do you shape that in oral and written language. So it is text-oriented, dealing with oral and written texts. It is focused on socio-cultural context right from the beginning, not as an additive extra, that is likely to be enacted. And here we're beginning to make the linkages. In particular, preferred probabilistic, no rules please, wording bundles in language that are shaped and show up, number one, in registers, and number two, show up in actual texts, and we will get to that, by giving us rich accounts of the semantics and the lexical grammar, that is how the language construes the particular situation, and what formal features are prototypically associated with that construal. Important. A particular instance of meaning making in spoken or written language is then seen as the result of choices from the resources the learner has available or chooses to deploy. So both things, of course, come in. What does the learner already have? And beyond that, what does he or she choose to deploy? Because even if I have it, I may not choose to deploy it. Or I can't deploy it because I don't have it. Right? A performance can then be assessed according to specifiable language-based criteria that inextricably link culture and content. Side note, systemic functional linguistics has no separate category of pragmatics for exactly that reason. Everything is a pragmatic event. There isn't a central meaning and a non-central meaning. Everything is meaning-making that is contextualized. So, we attempt to link culture and language, and we attempt to do so in a principled fashion that is usable and useful in diverse educational settings, though hopefully the system itself will be good enough to allow us to think of language use beyond the classroom as well. It is translatable into a developmental progression, and by that I mean ultimately a curricular progression. What would be most advantageously done first, second, third, and why? In order to facilitate advanced ability levels in both intercultural competence and L2 language use. Okay? What would we get? We would then get a kind of transcultural literacy a kind of expanded symbolic competence and a kind of intercultural competence as we want it. Let me summarize. We need a principled lexical grammar as a construal of cultural reality. That is what I meant when I said earlier, we need to shift to a functional theory of language. It needs to be usable for educational practice, and by that I mean it needs to be text-oriented, because if we're located only at the level of vocabulary, do they know this word, or do they know that word, or do they know this fact, which is usually what goes with words, that is not going to be sufficient. In any case, what does it say about their ability that they happen to know fact X? It has to be translatable into an extended curricular sequence because, after all, it is our task to enable them to become interculturally competent, both in language use and in the ability to negotiate these events. It has to be something that is transparent for teachers and learners. Both teachers and learners need to know in some fashion we are here and we are attempting to move there, rather than this is not good enough. And the only way I know, actually, is through sequenced genre-based tasks. The genre environment gives you the textual context, the tasks give you the specificity so that you can focus the activity in a very specific way. And of course, we would hope, ultimately, usually, though not necessarily with a study abroad environment in between, to move them towards advanced multiple literacies. And one overall way of looking at this entire progression, we would say, we would move them from the language resources that are necessary for recording or narrating genre to the language resources, and I mean this in the broad sense, for the explaining genre, factorial explanations or consequential explanations, and ultimately, at the end of the undergraduate sequence and actually rapidly moving into the graduate environment, the arguing genre, the essay, the discussion, the sophisticated interpretation. So that would be one way of laying out the entire trajectory, and underneath it, of course, we would then look at the resources. I'm going to make a very swift claim and go right on. In our department, I think we feel reasonably competent and confident in saying we taught them, we teach them, we learned them, whatever, language. The problem with that is something's missing. We claimed right in the beginning, now 15 years ago, that we were interested in both. We were going to claim language acquisition and cultural acquisition and content acquisition were going to happen at the same time. Well, we've spent the last 10 years, pretty much, talking about language acquisition. That's fine. The MLJ monograph, the 2010 monograph, was essentially the finishing touch to that particular project. And then came the morning after the night before, so to speak, and we said, and how do we know that they learned culture? Ay, 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 ay. We made this bold claim, it's time to go back to the drawing board. So guess what? We have another nice project. And we're calling it the Humanities Assessment Project, and we're working together with folks at the University of Hawaii, particularly John Norris, with whom we, of course, have collaborated extensively. And we are going to say we need to look at all of this again, because our educational goals were they learned both. How do you know? So you can say language plus. And we have said, these were our, remarkably enough, these were the 3 educational goals we stated in 1997. Must have been an illuminated moment. We said there's content learning with emphasis on historical information, especially 20th and 19th century events in the German-speaking area in relation to Europe. We want multiple perspectives on that content. And we did that by choosing lots of different texts, oral and written, that very often actually contradict each other, right in the curriculum. So no Leitkultur notions as though there were only one way of looking at the German cultural area. There is not. There's 101 ways of looking at it, and they can argue with each other. And then ultimately, we want students to take a self-reflective stance. Okay? So what are we doing? Following John Norris's good lessons learned with the language acquisition side, we're going back. We're going back to the entire curriculum, but right now with a particular focus, and we're saying, what are we actually doing in these classes that would enable content learning, that would enable multiple perspectives, and that would enable our students to have a reflective stance towards that. And this is the nice sheet, the template that we used last year to go through particularly the intermediate level and the advanced level in excruciatingly painful separate meetings by the people that have typically taught these text by text, statistic by statistic, video by video. What does it give us as far as the knowledge base that is being conveyed, the multiple perspectives that arise within an entire instructional unit, and the encouragement we're giving them, would you please think about this and position yourself vis-a-vis the things that are being said. So here's what we have done. We have clarified the goals of the assessment project, intended uses of the assessment, that's us and our students, determined the focus of the assessment, and we focused on intermediate and early advanced because the first one is the college language requirement. There's always a strategic reason for doing things like that. So we can say to the college, for instance, this is what we're getting, or actually this is what we're not able to get. And maybe the language requirement ought to be extended. Wish us good luck. And the early advanced, which for us is the third level, because that is where the School of Foreign Service ends its requirement. And that's a significant number of our students. And you can see, obviously, why these things are very important to us. And then we said, let's establish the criteria. And here you have an example, for instance. So this is literally how teams of faculty and graduate students sat down and took each particular instance and said, this is where it fits. The text, the genre, the cultural content, the multiple perspectives on German culture, and the reflective stance. And we were on one level very pleased, and on another level, not so pleased with what we saw. In the sense of, well, we're expecting them to do X, but where do we actually do it in the instruction? Well, we don't. Or at least we don't do it as well as we might. And what showed up is that the texts are usually quite good, but it's the pedagogy, the critical pedagogy that will lead to goal number 3. And that was one of the insights that hit us. We actually selected the texts reasonably competently, but to what extent are we using instruction to foster the reflective stance, rather than the plain Jane reading of what the text says, which is complicated enough. So we're looking at the data from these multiple perspectives, and we have already drafted the Humanities Learning Goal Statement now in a more elaborated fashion for level 3. And now the project, this current academic year, actually we started it already last year, we collected one more time the writing tasks at the end of the course in the spring and the fall of 2011. And we have analyzed the data with respect to those learning goals. And the first thing is a holistic data analysis in order then to link that one to specific things in language use that would corroborate the holistic assessment. And here's where we are going as far as the theoretical underpinning is concerned. We're saying deep down, the whole project is one of developing multi-voicedness. Intercultural competence is one that moves from a single voice to the ability to take on multi-voiced perspectives with the knowledge underneath it. And we have found as one of the particularly useful constructs in systemic functional linguistics the construct of engagement and appraisal. And one can then do a language-based microanalysis. We have already done the preliminaries of it. Does this work? But before we know whether it works, we thought, let's first go to a holistic assessment, and then once we have done the holistic assessment, we will then look at, is there a high correlation or a medium correlation or a no correlation, God forbid, between the holistic assessment and the actual language features in terms of engagement and appraisal. What do I mean by that? I'm not going to regale you with too much of that, but as the term says, appraisal theory looks at attitude, affect, judgment, and appreciation, looks at graduation, how forcefully is this done, how focused is it, and is it monoglossic or heteroglossic? Is it a single voice, or does it involve multiple voices where I take into consideration what somebody else has said? And there is linguistic evidence available for tracking these kinds of things. Theoretically, we're linking SFL to Bakhtinian dialogism. We are saying that it is indicative on the one hand of cultural norms, at the other end it is indicative also of choices, and this shows up in the various aspects of the grammatical system understood expansively as a meaning-making resource, and the expected development we want to see is from unmediated expression, otherwise known as I have an opinion, right? True or not, we have plenty of evidence on TV for lots of folks right now having lots of opinions. And movement towards a behavior to much more judicious evaluation of phenomena, and that's what we call increasing heteroglossia, where institutionalized cultural norms, of course, are part and parcel of it. In this particular culture, this is how you judge these things, because this is how they think about these matters. Here's a quick and dirty summary of what the engagement system does. Is it a bare assertion? That's a monoglossic statement. Is it heterogloss in I'm disclaiming something, I'm proclaiming something, I'm entertaining other possibilities, I'm attributing something, I'm acknowledging something, I'm distancing myself from something. All of these things show up in language. And to what extent do we have evidence in the stuff the learners produce to allow us to see their evolving intercultural competence? You can say bare assertions, hearsay, unattributed stuff, contextually appropriate authorial voice, and using a range of engagement resources. And that is literally where we are. We just spent 2 days ago a huge amount of time arguing over these things because the holistic rating took place over the Christmas break because nobody else has anything to do. And we looked at these and very specifically laid out what do we expect them to do as far as content is concerned, what do we expect them to do as far as multiple perspectives are concerned, and what do we expect them to do as far as a reflective stance is concerned. Highly specific on these things as far as goals, but we want to see how it shows up. And here's what we're finding, of course. An affirmation of the intricate relationship between lexicogrammatical resources and textual meaning making. What else is new? If they don't have the language, they can't do it. Right? There has to be a certain base, in other words, before we can expect any of this to happen. Particularly, what they need to have is a flexibility with complex clausal structures, various resources for sequencing of events, for comparison and contrast, for cause and effect, for appraisal and engagement, so that they can deploy this at the whole textual level. They cannot be expected to do this if we have not provided the necessary basis for it. Okay? There is an intricate relationship, and there was another one of those comments where when somebody made it around the table, we said, duh. All three areas, of course, are intricately interrelated. The content, the multiple perspectives, and the reflective stance are intricately interrelated. What we also found was there's an advantage to having a shared textual source for assessment. In this particular case, the writing task is looking, a relatively complicated writing task at the end of the third intensive semester, where they are supposed to look at the integration of Vietnamese immigrants to Germany, which for most Americans say, Vietnamese immigrants to Germany, where did they come from? Well, they came from the old East German environment, where they were massively imported into East Germany at the time. And of course, with the fall of the wall, their entire legal status and social status changed dramatically. And so we talked about this. Of course, we talked about Turks, but we also talked about other immigrant groups, and we focused on the Vietnamese because they're such an interesting case. And the writing tasks has 3 relatively extended texts underneath it, and they are to then formulate a journalistic piece that could show up in a German publication about what is the situation of the current situation of Vietnamese immigrants in Germany. The reason why it all of a sudden hit us that that was actually a very nice thing to have is because there's a knowledge base there, but they need to be able to access that knowledge base. So it is always true that people have different background knowledge. But here, one thing that is implicitly being assessed is, did we teach them how to read texts critically? So that they can get the information out of the documents, reshape it into the task that we have given them, and be multi-perspectival. So any number of times, this sophisticated ability to move back and forth between the general and the specific, the conceptual and the real for exemplification becomes very obvious. And of course, we all said, guess what? L1 literacy. Comes into play one more time. Nothing new there. And then we actually sort of toying with this idea for the next round, if we don't have anything else to do, the potential usefulness, and of course the literature has said that, of an essay written in the L1 that would use the same text base and see what they would do with it if they did this in English. Okay? What's important is a well-specified curricular context in order to be able to read the findings. Unless you had some sort of a framework, you wouldn't even know what to make out of any of it, is my contention. And you certainly wouldn't be able to use it for further development. The impact of text selection in order to get at a multiplicity of perspectives. I know that textbooks, of course, in general are extraordinarily poor in that regard, which is why we ditched them all. And we created our own because we wanted the multiple perspectives. And beyond that, the importance of a much more explicit pedagogy that highlights the humanities goals of the program, and the nature of that multi-perspectivalism in terms of the language being used to express multiple use. If it is tested, it's likely to be understood better, taught better. Think through and specify the it you want to assess on your terms. Curricular thinking is not an option. Linking language and cultural content is also not an option. It is instead the unique intellectual contribution of foreign language study in the academy. Everyone across your campus trades in culture. We trade in language and culture. Thanks.